Okay, hopefully that's recording. So yeah, back to my question. And my question, just for the purpose of the recording, was we're looking at innovation, and we know from this opening screen that we need to think about user-centered, user research, user-centric innovation, building user-centric experiences. And we talked about, as marketeers, where we might get data from. And so somebody suggested the website. So my follow-up question was, what data about website visitors are we interested in, and why, and where might we get that information if we were setting a business up, for example, in the UK? So what sort of data do we need about our website visitors, do you think? Any ideas? Just while you're thinking, I'm going to show you another site here. So can I ask you, have you heard of Google Analytics before? How did you hear about it? Like, what can you tell me about it? Anything? Okay, some data. Yeah. Anything else? You had your hand up as well. What do you? Where have you come across it, or did you just hear about it? Have you looked at it? Have you used it? Anything? What could you tell me about anything to do with Google Analytics?
How many users is my website, and then what kind of people is interested in my website.
Okay. Yeah. So is that what you meant when you said website data, or did you mean something else?
I would like to mention when I want to say the business own website if they has.
Right.
So when people enter that website, they sometimes need to log in if they want to use it.
Sure. Yeah.
So in that case, the business can get some like personal data, for example, name, sex, address.
Right.
The kind of the basic geographic demographic data.
Okay.
First party data.
First party data, yeah. Absolutely, that's a good point. So just to be clear on this, so what Google Analytics gives you, and this is an example of a Google Analytics site, I'll explain it in a minute. This doesn't give you first party data, which you're talking about. This is third party data, so it's anonymized. So we don't know who the visitors are, where we know where they've come from, we know what pages they visit on the site, we know if they've purchased anything, and a lot of other things that this tells us, but it doesn't tell us the specific person. In order, and you're quite right, in order to get that personal data, we need to have that login mechanism, which gives us the first party data, and which is very, very important. And that's why a lot of businesses will run some sort of loyalty membership program, because you need to log in to get access to your account, and then they can see where you're visiting and so on. Now, that's not to say that the Google Analytics data is not relevant, because it still is relevant. And if we are running a website, we still need to know about what all our visitors are doing, not just the ones who are logging in, but everybody. So this is an example of a live Google Analytics site for the Google Merchandise Store. And Google makes this available really to learn more about Google Analytics, like for training purposes. But it is live data. So these are people, for example, who have purchased merchandise on the Google Store. Could be like a bag, or a top, or a t-shirt, or a sweatshirt, or you can see here a hoodie, a backpack, t-shirt, etc., etc. So it's live data. But where I think it's interesting is it gives you an opportunity to look at some real Google Analytics data and get a feel for the kind of information that you can get through the Google Analytics platform, which is, because it's a free tool at the moment, then it's very, very useful for giving us that kind of user data that is essential. Now, I could spend the next 2 hours and many, many more hours going through all the Google Analytics stuff, and that, of course, is not the topic for today's lecture. That being said, I think it's a good practical example of where you can get user data from in terms of your user research. So so just before I leave this, I would encourage you, that's the best word, I would encourage you to have a look at this website. It's very, very easy to get to. I just put in the Google Analytics demo account into Google, and a few clicks. I think you have to register. You'll be there within 10 minutes. And it's a nice way of understanding the kind of analytical data you can get about your website. Now, not Google doesn't run in all parts of the world, in all countries. I'm very aware of that, but most countries will have their own proprietary platforms, right? And it's the same principle. It may not look exactly like Google Analytics, obviously, but the idea of looking at your visitors, traffic, as they call it, traffic to your website, is the same. And one of the key bits of advice I always give to people when they're looking at Google Analytics is try to tailor it, make it more bespoke to what it is you're interested in, right? So you may be, for example, interested in a particular demographic. You may be interested in people who are coming to your website from a certain region of the world or a certain city. You may be interested in people who are coming to your website who are on their iPhone rather than, say, on a laptop, and so on. So, in other words, one of the powerful tools within analytics is the ability to segment your traffic so that you understand not just the generic users, but certain types of users. Then you can really start to look at how did they come to your website? Where did they come from? What did they visit on your website, right? Because if we're offering new services and new products on our website, we want to know, is that popular with people? Are people visiting those pages? Are they buying those things? Are they repurchasing them? So the whole idea of using technology to get a better understanding of your customer behavior is a very, very important part of user research that we see here on the screen. Now, the one thing, just before I move on, which will be relevant actually to the Good Kitchen example, just to share with you briefly, is platforms like Google Analytics, and it applies as well to social media analytics. So if you're running a YouTube channel or an Instagram account, they all provide their own data and analytics where you can understand how people engage with your account, with your page. So it's important, but that tells you what is happening, but it doesn't tell you why it's happening. And really, the only reason to understand, the only way you can understand why somebody is doing something is to ask them, is to do primary user research. But the problem with primary user research is the cost, right? It takes time, and time is money, and it's a very expensive exercise to do focus groups and what have you. So there is another development. I was actually talking to some other students about this a couple of days ago. I just wanted to share it with you because I think it's an interesting trend and one that you need to be aware of. So I'm going to type in here AI sin. I can never type very well when I'm standing up, but yeah, that'll do. There was one particular website I was looking at, but any of these will probably be okay. Yeah, now let me go to it should come up because I was on it the other day. There we go. So this is an example. Again, I haven't got time to go into all the kind of, the nuts and bolts and details, but you can have a look in your own time. And I would also encourage you to do a little bit of background research into this idea of synthetic users. Okay, so you saw me type that into Google. So if I just do it again, you'll see the spelling. You can go into AI mode if you want, and that's the word synthetic. That's how you spell it. Okay, so basically, synthetic almost means artificial, not real. That's what the word means. Okay, and you can see straight away here, synthetic users, user research without the headaches. What that means is user research without the hassle and the cost. Now, just before we go on, I'm not suggesting that doing synthetic user research is the same or as good as doing it with real humans. However, what I find quite interesting about this, it's a good example of the application of artificial intelligence to marketing, right? And that's the world that you're already in, and even much more than me. You're going to be going into that world in a lot more detail. It doesn't matter what country you end up in, whether it's UK, the US, China, other parts of the world. AI is going to be right there driving a lot of what happens in the world of marketing and the world of innovation. So we do need to understand. We can't, not be aware of it. And so I do find this quite an interesting field. And again, just literally, if I just pull the AI definition here, so these are AI generated profiles designed to simulate, copy the behavior, preferences, and decision making processes of real humans. Now, the interesting bit is when you start to look at where they get their data from. So, if you look at, for example, these guys, and as I did, you do a little bit of background research using the AI mode, if you like, in Gemini or whatever tool you use. You find out where they get their information from. And the profiles that they offer their clients is based on literally trillions of data points about user behavior. And of course, that's the power of AI, isn't it? It can work with massive sets of data. And based on so many data points, so much information, they have been able to pull together these AI generated profiles or synthetic user profiles, right? So let's say, for example, you've got an idea for a business or you're running a business and you have an idea for a new product. You might turn to a company like this, and there'll be lots of competitors, obviously, and say, well, I don't really have the budget to do a lot of very expensive primary user research, but I would like to test this idea that I have on these kind of segments, right? So say, for example, you are in the business of, as these guys are, this is a company I'm got some familiarity with. So as you can see, they sell dog beds, kind of posh dog beds to people who own dogs. There's a very studious dog. And you might say, well, I want to launch a new product, a new type of dog bed. And I think it might appeal to female owners of dogs rather than men. I want to test that. So rather than setting up a focus group of 6 or 7 women who own dogs and asking them a whole bunch of questions, a lot of expense, a lot of cost, you could use synthetic profiles to test your new service idea or your new product idea, right? So it's how you can actually use AI to support user research to drive innovation. Okay, so just a few takeaways then from the beginning of the lecture. We looked at website. Of course, there's not just website data, there's social media data, isn't there? There's email marketing, right? We might be doing email newsletters. So there's lots and lots of data that we can get to analyze our user behavior. Now, here's the thing. It's all very well in theory saying all of this data exists, but one of the problems facing a lot of businesses, particularly smaller ones, is they don't have the time, they don't have the skills or the resources and the knowledge to know how to analyze that data. That's why they may decide to outsource that to an agency or an external company like the one we're just looking at. Okay, so you need to be aware not just about theoretically what you can do, but also practically what is actually happening. And that's one of the challenges facing a lot of small and medium-sized businesses and startups, is they don't have that knowledge, skills, expertise, time, whatever, resources to do it. Okay, so I would encourage you guys to think about how user research can be used to underpin innovation. But as we're going to see briefly in a minute about with revisiting the Good Kitchen case study, it's not all about digital data. It's also about connecting with the human, with the person. So I'm not advocating that everything is digital, everything is artificial, everything is, you do need to connect with real people to have real experiences. Right. So with that being said, I'm going to give you just a reminder of what the Good Kitchen case study was about. So I'll let this lady talk for just a few minutes on design thinking, but I'm not going to play the whole video again because I do remember showing this to you with the service dominant logic lecture. So you've probably forgotten it, to be fair, but I don't want to play the whole thing. And the link for this video is in that SDL slide deck, so you can go back and listen to it. But let's just listen for maybe max 5 minutes to her introduction to the case, and then we'll look at it in terms of what it means for innovation. Oh, I think I need to I need to select the speakers in the lecture theater. Hang on a second.
Design thinking process that we've been talking about, I'd like to tell you a story about design thinking in action. As we go through that story, I will note different tools and approaches that are being used. Then at the end of this session, I'll tell you about some additional resources we have available so that you can learn more about them. Now, you can use design thinking to solve all sorts of problems. Let's walk through one example to illustrate what it looks like in the real world. To do so, we're going to travel to Denmark, a country long recognized for its distinctive attention to design. The Danes, like citizens in most developed countries, recognize that the aging of their population presents many challenges. One of these is serving the more than 125,000 senior citizens who rely on government-sponsored meals. Danish municipalities deliver subsidized meals to people who suffer from a reduced ability to function, whether that is due to illness, age, or other conditions.
Does this ring a bell? Do you remember some of this, or too long ago? Do you remember seeing the video? Okay, I'm pretty certain I showed it to you, but let's play it for a few more minutes. Yeah.
Many of these seniors have nutritional challenges and a poor quality of life because they...
Okay, well, listen, if you haven't seen it before, sorry, that's why I asked you. In that case, we'll just play it, right? Because it's a really interesting case study. I think it's a really nice example of innovation. It's very practical. It's something that happened in the real world. It's not a commercial example, as you can tell from her introduction. It's about how you bring meals to senior citizens. And what really amazed me about this video, this example, was I always associated Denmark as being a very rich country, like a high, rich value country. And it is in many ways. But actually, when you hear some of the stats, the statistics she comes out with, there's clearly still a social problem facing older people in terms of bad nutrition, which really surprised me in a country like Denmark. But there you go. A lot of isolation of these people living on their own, not so much family support. And I think, in certain countries that I've traveled to, there's a much better, what's the word, family collective, where families look after each other more, right? The extended family where, and I think that's in certain countries and certain cultures, that's really strong. I think sometimes in Western Europe, it's not as strong, right? There's more isolation, of older people in particular. So it's an interesting case study of innovation in a social setting, not innovation in a commercial company setting. I do have some commercial examples to share with you as well, but I think it's interesting to look at this as a social example rather than a commercial example. So let's hear it. Let's listen to it then. It's 14 minutes, so it's not too long.
Simply do not eat enough. An estimated 60% of elders living in assisted living have poor nutrition. An estimated 20% are actually malnourished.
That surprised me, yeah.
In response to this growing social problem, the municipality of Hustobrouw decided to dedicate their efforts to improve meal service for seniors, and they invited Danish innovation firm Hatch and Bloom to work with them to figure out how to improve the nutrition of their elderly population.
I think what I'll do, guys, as the video plays, it'll make it slightly longer, but probably more interesting for you. Rather than me just letting her talk for 14 minutes, I'll pause it and just give you some things to think about, because I find personally, if I just sit and listen to a video, after a few minutes, my mind begins to wander. So if I pause it, you're kind of like, oh, you have to sort of listen a wee bit. So she mentioned the design agency Hatch and Bloom. I think they're Danish, but I did have a look at their website. They've got some good examples on there of design thinking innovation. So, when you've got a moment, you could have a look at their website. Hatch and Bloom is the name of the agency, which I think is a Denmark-based agency. There may be links on the YouTube channel to them. I'm not too sure, but you could have a look. So whenever she says something or it's something in the case study that I want to highlight or emphasize, I'll pause the video and we'll have it, I'll do that. Okay.
Municipal leadership saw the project initially as straightforward.
There you go, Hatch and Bloom.
In order to get seniors to eat more, the current menu just needed improving. And they wanted Hatch and Bloom to ask elderly clients about their menu preferences. This is a great example of how too narrow a definition of the problem to be solved can drive a lot of innovation right out the window before you even get started.
Right. So she's used the word innovation for the first time in the video. And what she's saying there is, if you think back to SDL, which stands for SDL. I said it several times at the beginning of the lecture. We had a lecture on it. It's somewhere sitting on Blackboard. Can you remember what that stands? I'll remind you: service, dominant, logic. Right, logic, right? It's kind of, logic is a way of thinking. That's why they call it logic. So thinking about making service the dominant logic rather than manufacturing or the product. And I thought, obviously, because it's a services marketing module, it's very appropriate to talk about service dominant logic rather than manufacturing or product dominant logic. So what this lady is saying is one of the problems with innovation is that some innovators or companies, or in this case, local government, they take too narrow a view of the problem. They see the problem as the product is wrong, right? But what we're going to see here is that the solution was not about the product, it was about something else, okay? So one of the things you need to think about with innovation is, we have this saying, take off the blinkers, right? So have a look so you can see a much more holistic view of the problem. Don't just think it's a product problem. It might be more of a service-based problem, okay? So let's continue.
The opportunity turned out to be much greater. And what Hatch and Bloom ultimately produced was much more than just a new menu. It was a completely redesigned meal service that offered higher quality, more flexibility, and increased choice.
So there you go. So what the agency did, Hatch and Bloom, is they stepped back, and instead of thinking, oh, well, the reason that the seniors, which basically means older people, okay, and the reason that there's a problem is they don't like the food, they don't like the menu. The problem is the menu. But actually what Hatch and Bloom discovered by using design thinking techniques, which we'll hear about in a moment, is that it was much bigger than that, right? And she used the word opportunity, which is interesting. So she's actually saying that when you start to think about innovation, you're thinking about where do the opportunities lie to innovate the service. Okay, so let's hear about how they did that, how they evaluated that, and so on.
This dramatic reframing of the opportunity emerged from the user-centered design approach that Hatch and Bloom brought to the process, in which they discovered that merely fixing the menu wouldn't solve the nutrition problem. Let's look at some specifics about how they did it. They began by exploring what is, digging deep into seniors' behaviors, needs, and wishes, using observation and interviewing to identify their elderly clients' living situation and try and get at their unarticulated needs.
Right, so let's think about that. Here's an example of an older lady, obviously. I don't know if this is a real example, but they're showing the image of, what a person might be looking like. So it's maybe a lady in her late 80s, we don't know, but that doesn't really matter, it's not the point. So the lady doing the the lady doing the speaking, who we just heard from, she talked about reframing the problem, right? And she then has gone on to say, that's why she's showing the picture, that the design team went into these old people's homes and spoke to them and observed them, right? Observation and interviews. So there's two techniques, user research techniques, for understanding the nature of the problem. Now, clearly, with this demographic, using any kind of technology probably wouldn't be very good, right? So these are older people who are probably not comfortable. I don't want to generalize, because there might be people a bit younger who are very comfortable with technology. But this was more about human-centered research, right? Talking to them, observing, and so on, okay?
The approach they chose to use was ethnographic. The specific tool they used was journey mapping. The journey mapping tool follows a customer or stakeholder as they receive a product or service or go through a process. It pays attention to what designers call the job to be done.
So she mentioned ethnography or ethnographic research. Is that something you've come across before in any of your research? Are you doing a research methodology class or course about how to do research, or is that coming a bit later? Because that might be something you do for your dissertations. Have you done anything on research methods? Okay, can you remember what the lecture talked about? What was the main kind of research methods? Qualitative and quantitative, right? Okay. And where do you think ethnographic research would sit in? Qualitative, right? Okay. So quantitative research is kind of more like surveys, right? Working with data analysis. And why do you think that might not be the most appropriate type of research for this problem, the one we're talking about with the older people? Why might that quantitative research not be so appropriate?
I think, for example, if they do survey passively, all the question might based on the agency, so they actually don't know what is the problem. So
Right.
they couldn't give them the scale to answer to give to the older people to answer. However, with this method, they can be able to understand deeply about why it happened
Yeah.
and what the customer expects. So they can change in order to make it better.
Yeah, that's great. Great answer. That's exactly it. So qualitative research is often around the why rather than the what, isn't it? Surveys are better at surfacing the what, or what do you do? Well, you can ask why you do it as well, because you can give people categories. Can't you say on a scale of 1 to 5, how important are the following 10 reasons for why you buy this cosmetic, for example, right? Well, that means you have to already have those scales, don't you? Those variables. In this case, it was more about discovery, right? Which is why they used ethnographic research. So if we look at what the AI result is telling us, that ethnographic research is qualitative, where researchers immerse, right? So when you immerse, you go deep into the problem. It's almost like, not quite as much as this, but it's almost like you be living like one of the old people is living, right? Because otherwise, it's very difficult to understand their lived experience. Particularly, like if you guys are mainly in your 20s, how do you understand the lived experience of somebody in their 80s? Not easy. You might say, well, I'll go and talk to my grandparents and see what they'll help. Yeah, and that's true. But outside of your own family, you will not be mixing generally with people who are in a much, much older age bracket. And therefore, it's harder for you to understand their needs. And therefore, it's harder for you to understand how to innovate. How do you innovate something for somebody who you know little about? It's almost impossible. So ethnographic research is about trying to put yourself in their shoes, immerse yourself in their life. And it says in the natural environment of a specific social or cultural group. Well, the natural environment in this case was the home of the seniors, the older people, that we're talking about in the case study. And just to finish that, to observe their daily lives, interactions, and shared meetings. So that's ethnographic research. Okay, it's a form of qualitative research that employs methods of qualitative research like interviews and observation. Okay, so let's go back, and she's about to talk about journey mapping. Now, you've heard, we talked about journey mapping, haven't we, before in this course, and Karen has touched upon it. So journey mapping is another kind of, if you like, ethnographic technique. So we've talked about interviews, we've talked about observation, but we can also talk about journey mapping. What does the journey of one of these seniors look like when they're getting a meal provided by the local government to them? So we're going to hear about that. And the word there, experience. So we know in services marketing, we're talking about an experience. We're marketing an experience. And when we talk about innovation, we want to think about how can we innovate that experience, make that experience much more high quality, much higher value. Do you remember? You probably don't, because it was a good few weeks ago, but you should have a look again at the service dominant logic slide deck that I covered with you, but also have a look at the service dominant logic references, the articles. And I remember providing you with 5 specific references to do with SDL, written by the originators, Vargo and Lush, of SDL. I don't know if this rings any bells with you. And I also suggested, don't know if any of you have done it, having a look at one of the large language models called Google Notebook LM. Now, you should, as far as I know, as students here, have access to the pro version for free, but that may or may not be still available. You have to look at that. But you can upload sources to Notebook LM, like articles, and then you can use your prompt, prompting the AI to start asking questions about SDL, service dominant logic. I think that's quite a nice way to get into the subject matter. I'm not advocating, just to be clear for the recording, I'm not advocating that you use AI to write any of your assignments, but I don't see why you can't use AI as a research partner, a research assistant. Okay, so, but if there's time, I'll come back a little bit to SDL shortly.
In some ways, journey mapping is not that different than the kind of flowcharts or supply chains we might use in business. But there are some crucial differences. Journey mapping recognizes that most of us are trying to do jobs that are both functional and emotional. A lot of the unarticulated needs turn out to be on the emotional side, making this tool very valuable for uncovering hidden opportunities to create better value for people.
Do you remember the value proposition canvas? Do you remember talking about, have you come across that? Does that ring a bell? The value proposition. So when she talks about jobs to be done, does that ring a bell? Where she talks about functional and emotional jobs to be done. Would that be right? Okay. Let's think about, what's the last thing, can somebody tell me, what's the last thing that you purchased? Let's not say cup of coffee, or something a little bit more substantial. Give me an example of something you bought recently. That laptop, right? Very nice. Good. Are you happy with the purchase? It's okay. Not too. That doesn't sound. Well, that doesn't sound great, but hopefully it'll get. Right. Would you say, when you bought that computer, would you say it was only a functional decision, or did any emotions come into it? And if so, do you mind me asking what kind of emotions you experienced or put into the purchase?
I get my own laptop with the same RAM.
Yeah.
So I actually also search for different RAM.
Okay.
They also have like intermediate RAM.
Yeah.
However, I still decide to purchase the RAM. I think because I feel like I committed with that RAM for so long.
Okay. So you have an emotional attachment to the Apple brand for computers, not necessarily. Do you have an iPhone as well?
Yeah.
So that might be related to that. So, okay, and that makes perfect sense, because Apple's more expensive, isn't it, than HP or IBM or some other kind of let's say cheaper laptops. Now you might say, well, it's better quality, but that's not the only reason, is it? There's something else going on. It's also a design loyalty, right? So it's emotional. And we talked about this. I remember talking to you guys about this a good few weeks ago. Pretty much anything we buy, and I'm not really talking about a cup of coffee necessarily, although that could be coming into it, is very rarely only a functional, practical purchase. There's always, often, sometimes, I'll say always an emotional element involved. Okay? And that's not just buying a service like a holiday, right? Or, buying a dog, having a pet for the family, which is definitely an emotional purchase. But it's also, many things that on the surface seem like they're only functional, but there's an emotional element to them. And we're going to find out in this case study in a minute, when I let her talk again, I keep interrupting her, that there was a lot of emotions underpinning this service for these older people. And I would argue that when we think about innovation, we need to think about innovating not just at the functional level, but also understanding the emotional purchase. And you know what I mean by emotion? I don't just mean I'm happy, I'm sad. Obvious emotions. It could be excitement. It could be anxiety. It could be fear. You know, it could be anger. It could be, there are many types of emotions, right? So we need to think broadly about that. So let's see what she has to say about this.
Hatch and Bloom used journey mapping to trace the experience of the elderly from beginning to end. They rode with food service employees who delivered the meal. They accompanied them into the homes. They watched as clients prepared the food, added ingredients, set the table, and then finally ate the meal. They also interviewed the supervisor of the food preparation process.
So I'm doing this deliberately. I hope you're okay with this. But so they did the whole end-to-end journey, right? They went to the home, they rode with the van or whatever was delivering the meal. They watched as the older people put the ingredients together and cooked the meal and so on. So they looked at the whole journey, the whole service journey, okay? Because sometimes when we think about innovation, we might want to think about what part of the customer's journey are we innovating? Are we innovating the whole thing, or is it just one part of the innovation? If you think about hotels where you do self-check-in, right? There's nobody on reception. You just go straight to the door. You use your phone to unlock the door. That's an example of where one part of the user journey, there's been technical innovation. So we can think about innovation for the whole experience or for specific elements of the user's journey. But she's about to say that the user research wasn't only with the old people, the seniors, it was also with those who were preparing the meals and delivering the meals to the seniors.
Her workplace. And what they saw in the kitchen surprised them. Working in a public service kitchen was a low status job in Denmark, and kitchen employees seemed demoralized and unmotivated. It was not going to be enough to focus on the needs of the elderly, team members realized. They would need to address the problems of the employees producing the meals as well.
And that makes so much sense, doesn't it? Because if we think about services and we think about that pyramid, the employee is such a central part of the experience, of the delivery of the service. And she's highlighting that the people who worked in the kitchens, who were preparing the meals for the seniors, were demoralized. They were not motivated. It was seen as a low status job, right? So they weren't feeling too good about themselves. And they were preparing what they probably thought to be very boring, low quality meals, which just reinforced their feeling that they were kind of low status and, repetitive and not very interesting. So we're going to see how that was addressed and how when you want to innovate, you're innovating the whole system. You're not just innovating one part of the system.
And so the team decided it was important to broaden the scope of the project beyond just improving the menu. And they helped the municipal officials understand why this was necessary. From this dual focus on the people preparing the meals and on the seniors receiving them, a set of interesting insights began to emerge. They discovered that both the seniors and the kitchen workers had important emotional needs that were not being met. They were both experiencing feelings of disconnection and alienation. The social stigma of even having to receive such assistance weighed heavily on the clients. They were embarrassed. Help for cleaning was considered acceptable in Danish culture, but help for more personal needs was much less so. It also mattered who was providing the help. In Denmark, a senior hoped to receive assistance from a relative or a friend. If that was not possible, perhaps one could hire someone. But it was a last resort to receive assistance from.
So you see what's going on here. There's what called stigma, social stigma about receiving meals as a senior, right? It's kind of like, it's not a good thing. And that's not something that you would really ever be able to discover by doing purely quantitative research. People wouldn't talk about that kind of personal thing, particularly where it's they feel embarrassed or shameful about it.
The government. Also painful to seniors was the loss of control over their food choices. We discovered that deciding what kind of food they put in their mouths was the second most important thing for the elderly after taking care of their personal hygiene, the head of the Hatch and Bloom team told us. And they hated eating alone because it reminded them that their families were no longer around. All of these factors contributed directly to the nutrition problem, and put it in a broader context. The less they enjoyed their situation, the smaller their appetites. The kitchen workers, Hatch and Bloom learned, were making the same boring, low-cost meals over and over, not because they lacked skills or because they just didn't care, but because of the perceived economic and logistical constraints that prevented them from doing something more interesting. The team also found positive things, however. They discovered that the generation of seniors they studied was very responsible and capable in the kitchen and had a keen sense of the seasons and positive associations with seasonal foods such as apples in the fall and strawberries in the summer. They also often tried to customize their meals by adding spices or using their own potatoes or vegetables. The Hatch and Bloom team also discovered that the kitchen workers really did care and wanted to do a good job. Once team members had finished their ethnographic research, they moved into the what-if stage. For this, they wanted to enlist a broader group of stakeholders in understanding the nature of the challenges and participating in creating a new and better meal service.
So you can see here the first stage was what is happening. And then they're now going to look at, I guess, where the innovation comes in is what if we did this, or what if it was like this? Okay, so this is more about the vision and the innovation and what's possible going forward.
They wanted to co-create with their important stakeholders. To accomplish this, they had a series of workshops that brought together a diverse set of stakeholders. It included public officials, volunteers, experts in elderly issues, kitchen workers, and employees of residential care facilities. Together, they reviewed the ethnographic research and developed insights and design criteria to form idea generation. This kind of co-creation is another important design tool. Inviting stakeholders into the creative process creates ownership and engagement as well as producing better ideas.
So the diagram she showed a moment ago, I won't go back because of time, but that diagram, the different stakeholders, right? That's an example of an ecosystem. And when you look at the literature on SDL, which stands for, good, got it now, service dominant logic, they talk quite a bit about how value is created in the ecosystem. And that's why it's interesting to read the papers, because you start to get into that. So for example, if you had 5, 10 sources about SDL uploaded to Notebook, the AI I told you about, that could be one of your prompts. You could ask, for these 10 sources, how important is the ecosystem theme? And it will pull that out. And that's where it gets interesting for me, when you start to prompt through your own knowledge of the topic. Okay, so for innovation, we need to not just look at the seniors and the people delivering the meals, but other stakeholders in the ecosystem. But we'll take a break for 5 minutes, because I got to stick to that. I'll give you a little bit of rest, and then we'll start again. Okay, so let's pick up then where we left off with her, and we'll hear now a little bit about co-creation and the solution.
The co-creation tool will turn out to be useful in every one of the 4 questions, as you'll see later. In the second question, Hatch and Bloom used a brainstorming process in which facilitators used analogies as trigger questions to help shift participants' mental models of food service as they generated ideas. The facilitators asked participants to think of the kitchen as a restaurant triggering a creative rush. The kitchen workers, they assumed then, must be the chefs. And if they were the chefs, who were the waiters? This began to bring ideas like the condition of the vehicles used for meal delivery into the discussion.
So you can see what they've done here is they've created, I think it's interesting, they created a scenario where they've kind of reframed the problem, and rather than talking about the way it is at the moment, is what if we were to imagine this is more like a restaurant scenario where the old people are our customers, right? The kitchen workers are chefs. The kitchen is like belonging to a restaurant, and the delivery of the meals to the old people's homes is like the waiters. And once you start to look at something through a different lens, you can then start to imagine how the service could be innovated and look better, look different.
They continued to work with the restaurant analogy as they considered the food itself. Until that point, the menus had been minimalist, factual descriptions of the food, perhaps detailing how it was prepared. For instance, one item read, liver, potatoes, and sauce. That's not exactly a description that will make your mouth water, is it? But now participants in the workshop started to wonder, maybe we should look at actual restaurant menus. Maybe we should describe our meals in a completely different, more enticing way. The third workshop moved them into the what wow stage and continued to emphasize the design tool of co-creation. But this time, co-creation was used to test ideas rather than generate them. This third workshop was much more hands-on and involved prototyping, at least in a rough way, the solutions coming out of the what if workshops. For example, Hatch and Bloom work with participants on 3 different versions of the menu.
So we're talking about another kind of design thinking technique for innovation, which is prototyping. So again, it's rather than fully developing a new service or a new product, you test, a prototype on it, okay, like a trial version on that. And again, this is where in marketing, AI becomes quite interesting. So I was looking at an example the other day, the AI tool Midjourney, where you can generate image and video. So there's a lot of things you could do now. If you have, for example, if you had, say, an idea for packaging, a new packaging for your product, you could use AI to create 5 variations of what that package could look like and test that on your users. So there's a lot that can be done now that in the past would have been very costly, but with AI can be done even by smaller companies quite easily. So she's talking about prototyping now, the different types of meals.
Asking them which they liked and how they felt about various aspects, such as the colors they favored and whether they preferred photos or illustrations. They used a design tool called visualization to make these different options feel more real to participants. Visualization is one of the essential design tools. It's not about drawing, a skill that many of us don't have. It's about using imagery to make an abstract idea more public and more concrete so that it will be more visible, clear, and understandable to others. Hatch and Bloom didn't talk to people about the different options. They showed them the different options. They then moved into what works, testing prototypes with different combinations and ways of presenting the food with actual customers. The learning from this initial set of experiments resulted in a second project with some quick packaging design changes that allowed for more modular meals where components were separated instead of being mixed together. The process also yielded new uniforms for employees and a new name, The Good Kitchen, that reflected everybody's aspirations. It also included new communication channels, using newsletters and comment cards to keep clients and the kitchen staff in close touch with each other. And so, a process that began with a simple mandate, fix the menu, evolved into something much more significant as it moved through the 4 questions, using design tools like journey mapping, co-creation, prototyping, and experimentation. That process yielded a host of dramatic changes: a new menu, new uniforms for staff, new feedback mechanisms. But equally important, it made everyone involved cognizant of the real people they were serving or being served by. Today, Hoosterbrau's seniors know who is shaping their meatballs and preparing the gravy in the kitchen. And this relationship between the kitchen staff and the customers, which is now both personal and professional, has increased greatly the satisfaction of both. The results speak for themselves. Reorganizing the menu and improving the descriptions of the meals drove a 500% increase in meal orders in the first week alone. But the results were much more about the number of meals served. One of the most important elements of the transformation was the shift in employees' perception of themselves and their work. The kitchen workers are now much more satisfied and motivated. As a result, customers are happier with their food. If you have professional pride, you'll also cook good food. Anne-Marie Nielsen, the director of the Good Kitchen, told us. Good food has to come from the heart. What we are talking about in the Good Kitchen story is about more than just developing new products or services. We're talking about innovating the entire business model. I'd like you to spend a few minutes now listening to Jeremy Alexis, a professor at the Chicago Institute of Design, as he shares his views on the importance.
Okay, well, we can you can listen to that in your own time, but I think that that's been kind of a helpful, practical insight into innovation, right? Starting with the what if. What is, what if, what woes, I've missed one. Anyway, you get the idea, what works, right? So that right across the 4 steps. And actually, if you look back at my slide deck from SDL, where I featured the Good Kitchen as a case study, then you'll see, that's my examples, you'll see these slides. And so I'm not going to run that lecture again because I've already done that and I've recorded it. But now that you've watched the video again and you're thinking about innovation, then it wouldn't be a bad thing just to revisit, these SDL slides, because I used the Good Kitchen as a case study. I know you've probably forgotten about it, but these are the 5 kind of main principles of SDL. Again, I've given this lecture, you've got the recording, I'm not going to run it again, but a lot of what is here is actually illustrated by the Good Kitchen case study, like co-creation and value in use and so on, and emotional value, not just functional value, right? And you can see here in my slide deck on SDL, I did a comparison about the kind of goods dominant view versus the service dominant view. So the goods dominant view, if you like, GDL, goods dominant logic, is it's all about the menu, right? It's all about the menu. If we fix the menu, the seniors will be happy and the kitchen staff will be happy. But that clearly is not the case, right? Because there's a lot more going on here. There's the emotions about being lonely and isolated and having a bad experience, right? So the whole idea that, you needed to redesign the whole journey was part of it, okay? So it's all about, it was about understanding how you can better use the knowledge and skills of the staff to provide a better service to the client, to the customer, right? So in some ways, the meal, the product, is a vehicle for delivering the service of social connection, dignity, and nutrition. It wasn't just about a tasty meal, it was about treating the seniors with dignity, giving them their dignity back, right? Because remember the problem? They felt a little bit shameful that they had to take free meals from the government. That meant that in some ways they were a failure and they weren't seeing their family, not a great experience. So they were giving them not just the food, but also their dignity and that connection with people, right? Having a conversation with people. So you see how we have to understand value. If we're going to innovate, we need to understand what value we're giving and how value is understood by the client. Okay, so I would encourage you to have a look again at this design thinking SDL case study where we go through that good kitchen. Now that you've heard it today, it should be a lot easier to understand. And by the way, I also wanted to touch on this lecture on how you evaluate innovation. What's the return on innovation? Well, here we see it. Subscriptions increased tenfold. Elderly sickness absence went down by nearly 10%. Kitchen employee job applications more than tripled. And that's not taking into account the intangible evaluation of the innovation. So what might be one of the most important intangible indicators that this was successful? That isn't just measured by numbers, but it's more of a qualitative measurement. What do you think it might be? Yeah, the emotional and the social value, the dignity, the connections, the decrease in loneliness, probably the increase in mental health, right? We always talk about mental health a lot with younger people. In this case, it's mental health of older people, right? How do you measure that? You can't measure it through website visits or number of sales, right? But it's still really important. So if we're going to talk about innovation at an emotional level and not just a practical level, we need to understand how we innovate, how we measure the output at that level, okay? And that's where maybe you need experts, right? Like psychiatrists, people who specialize in the well-being of elderly people. They can give a quantifiable measurement or a better indicator of how successful your innovation has been, right? So who do we need to bring in order to measure the success of our innovation? That comes back to that ecosystem. Do you remember all those different stakeholders? Well, I might include like an expert in the well-being of elderly people. I might find somebody like that. There might be like a professor doing research like that at a university. I might ask him or her to come and give me their expert opinion. So who do we need to bring into our ecosystem to both create value, co-create value, and measure value? And actually, I think the Good Kitchen is a great example of co-created value, not just value delivered by one. So the rest of my slides, in many ways, just kind of build on the concepts. So in some ways, I've done it the other way around. I've done the case study first, and then the slides, right? But if we look at some of the slides that you've got in today's slide deck, this one, for instance, talks about the three elements of innovation. So the design, understanding, unarticulated needs, right? So even if you'd given the seniors a survey and asked them to fill in a questionnaire, I don't think they would have told you all of their needs because they wouldn't have wanted to talk about it. So that's what we mean about unarticulate. When you articulate your needs, you're explaining them in more detail. That's what articulation means. And very often, it's those unarticulated, invisible needs under the surface. They're the most important ones, and yet they're the hardest to get to. So that's one thing. Feasibility. How do we implement the innovation? Well, we saw there how they implemented the innovation by bringing together multiple stakeholders, the kitchen staff, the delivery, the experts, and so on. And viability. Well, we saw the outcome, didn't we? A tenfold increase, 3 times more this and that. We saw the metrics, the numbers, right? So it's desirable, feasible, and viable. The 3 elements there that you see on the screen. And that's the 4 areas, isn't it? The fuzzy end of innovation, right? What is, what if, what woes, what works, or what wows, what works, right? And we can see it all the way through to pilot, prototyping, launching, and so on. So this kind of like navigating the fuzzy front end means it's hard to define, right? But they were able to do that through different techniques, which we heard about. They reframed the experience, didn't they? They had this ethnographic approach, Hatch and Bloom, that's the agency. You can have a look at their work at some point if you want by looking at their website. And I quite like the way they reframed it according to different names for the stakeholders. So cooks became chefs, delivery drivers became waiters, and descriptions became like a menu in a restaurant, which allowed the older people to select, just like you would in a restaurant, and then put that together and make a nice meal. Okay, and that gave them their self-control back, because a lot of them had felt they'd lost their self-control. Okay, and this kind of gave it back to them. So I would always argue in marketing, whether it's a brand or a service like this, or social or commercial, if you can give people something at an emotional level, then you're much more likely, as with your laptop, to get brand loyalty. Because if you keep buying Apple products, even for 5 years, 10 years, not your whole lifetime necessarily, that is so valuable to a company. Once you've got a loyal, happy customer, you can start to introduce new products, new services, because you've got that person's attention, and you can co-create experiences and services with them as well. So we saw really, this is another example which I think is interesting, just to step away from the Good Kitchen for a minute. This is Marriott Hotels. So Marriott has what they call like a test hotel, a beta hotel in the US, which is an actual physical space where they can test and design innovations. Now, obviously, Marriott is a big company with a big budget. They can afford to do something like this. That would not be possible for a small company. But you can see here how they're actually testing different elements of the service blueprint. Okay, so they're looking at where we can innovate the service blueprint or the customer's journey, in different places, on stage and backstage. So we that idea, don't you, with the service blueprint, front stage and backstage. So we know that value co-creation, which we heard about in the Good Kitchen and service dominant logic, is basically on a spectrum. It's not like either or. You've got kind of low participation, high participation, right? So now I would also, this is actually in a B2C context, business to consumer, right? So if you go to hear a concert, it's quite low participation. You might applaud, you might go, hey, like that, whatever, take some photographs, but you're not really too involved. Obviously, if you go to have your hair cut, a little bit more kind of, the hairdresser will say, well, what do you want today? And what can I do? How much hair do you want to keep on? How much do you want? What color do you want? And all that. So there's a little bit more co-creation going on. But, we could also have high. So IKEA, I think, is quite a good example where the customer gets involved. But I would also argue in a B2B context, business to business, where you're maybe giving tax advice or financial consulting or marketing consulting, where you sit down with the business owner, or with 2 or 3 people from the business, and you co-create the solution together. You don't just go in there and say to the owner, all right, this is the website you need, this is the YouTube channel you need, this is the social media you need. You don't do that. You find out about the business. Tell me about your business. Tell me about your customers. What problems are you having? Where are the friction points? Where are the tensions? Right? That, and you listen and you consult. That's high level of co-creation. Okay. And that's where you need different skills. So if you're in a B2C environment, working for a brand, you may not have that much contact with the buyer. But if you're working for an agency, a marketing agency, or a consulting firm, you will have high levels of contact with the buyer. You need to have skills. You need to have communication skills, social skills, right? Listening skills, analytical skills, a lot of different things that you need to bring into that space. And incidentally, just as a sidebar, because I'm always quite interested in student employability, like the guys were saying at the beginning, we did that little intro there. Think about what sector you want to go into. Have you thought about that yet? I mean, whether you stay in the UK or go back to your respective countries, have you thought about the kind of company you want to work for? Have you thought about the sector you want to go into? Is it B2C? Is it B2B? What kind of skills do you think you need to go into that sector? I'm not just talking about getting your degree, your master's degree. I'm talking about more than that. What kind of skills will that employer want from you? What kind of things will they expect you to know about, like artificial intelligence, for example, right? So think ahead, guys. It's only, it's only April, nearly May, but you've got some time. What else can you do while you're here to acquire that experience and skills that will really put you in a good place come September, October when you're looking for a job? Yeah. Think about what you can do in the last 4 to 5 months. Really optimize your experience of being here at Southampton. So yeah, the ecosystem. We already looked at what an ecosystem looks like in the Good Kitchen, but the ecosystem could be not actually. It's also important to think about. The ecosystem is not just people; it's also technology. So technology applications like Google Analytics, like synthetic users, AI, that's in our ecosystem, right? And if we're going to innovate and create value, we need to think about our ecosystem in a bigger sense. Who do we co-create with and what do we work with, right? I've already mentioned about how AI could be used for innovation to prototype, right? To analyze big data sets. Do we have the right technologies in our ecosystem to drive innovation? This is really about measuring customer satisfaction and innovation. The Net Promoter Score, which I'm sure you've heard of, right? That basically kind of measures customer feedback and customer satisfaction. I wouldn't say it's redundant, but it's only one part of the picture. Okay, and we need to measure feedback and innovation feedback on different levels. You can have a look into that. There's not time at the moment to go into all of these in detail, but we saw with the Good Kitchen some of the metrics that you can use. Of course, in a commercial context, you will be interested in sales and market share, but there could also be marketing metrics, right? Like we talked earlier about website data, website traffic. If our website goes up, if our conversions go up, not just the number of people who visit our website, but the number of people who convert into a customer, right? We can start to measure on multiple levels the impact of our innovation. Okay. So yeah, so basically, we could be, and it's also worth looking at this last one. I think this is very important. What's called the recovery paradox. That very often, when you recover a customer who's been complaining, they become a more loyal customer than previously would have been the case. It's what's called the recovery paradox. So in a way, we need to think about, innovation as being in this kind of living service ecosystem with design, co-creation, and evaluation, as we heard about in the case study. And then just as a last kind of slide, that innovation is not just about what firms produce, but how you can better serve. And I think that's where SDL is a relevant theory alongside innovation. That's why I would encourage you to look at the slides and service dominant logic again. Try to get into the theory. It's a little bit impenetrable at times, a little bit difficult to get into. But I think after today's session, it'll probably be a bit easier. Look at some of the journal articles on SDL. I'm pretty certain on my slide deck I gave 5 of the key articles on SDL, which you can look at, because that gives you a good sort of conceptual way to think about something. Now, the other slide deck that's on Blackboard for today is examples of innovation. I'll leave that for you to look at in your own time. Those are just examples from Expedia and other companies that kind of what examples of innovation, of service innovation, right? So yeah, that really concludes the lecture for today on service innovation. So I hope that was helpful. I know Karen, I think, is with you next week. If you have any questions, outstanding questions on any elements, our emails, you can always reach out and we'll get back to you. Okay? So guys, enjoy the rest of the afternoon and the sunshine that we have, which is nice.